Welcome back to Everyday Economics, a podcast that helps you learn about the economic world happening around you every day. I'm your host, Chris Krug, president of the 501c3 nonprofit Franklin News Foundation. Everyday Economics is a production of America's Talking Network. You can check out all of our great podcasts at americastalking.com. To support Everyday Economics and podcasts such as this one, please make your tax-deductible charitable contribution by clicking the link in the show description. We're recording today's episode on Tuesday, April 18th. And joining me as always is Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist. Dr. O, we're going to get into the glossary today, and we're going to talk about some terms that are being thrown around, especially with what's going on in the economy, perhaps twisting some people, hurting their brains, confusing them. Inflation versus deflation. We're not talking about basketballs and inflating needles and the good old-fashioned red pump that would require a tetanus shot afterward, my friend. We're talking about economics. So could you please help explain clearly what is the difference between inflation and deflation, and why is deflation worse than inflation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, really important. Every time we talk on the show about inflation, and I say inflation is falling, some of the pushback you get from people on the streets is, well, no, prices are still higher than they were last month. Like, how could you say inflation is falling? And that's, I think, and so I decided that we were going to do this and to explain what that means, what that term inflation actually means, right? And so inflation is the rate of increase in prices over a given period of time. And that's usually a year. So what we do is we look at the consumer price index, for example, and we compare it to a year ago. And I think in February, year over year, price growth was 6.1%. And then in March, year over year, price growth was 5%. And so what that means is inflation is falling. It doesn't mean prices are falling. It just means prices are growing at a slower pace. And prices growing at a slower pace is actually a good thing. I think economists generally want low and stable inflation. In other words, kind of a price growth that is consistent with what households and businesses can afford in a growing economy. It's a normal thing. It's a good thing. So I wanted to kind of set the record straight so people can finally understand what that means. So how is it measured, right? It's basically, look, the consumer's cost of living depends on the prices of many goods and services and the share of each in the household budget. And so to measure that, the average consumer's cost of living, right? To measure that average consumer's cost of living, the government conducts household surveys to identify kind of this basket of goods, right, of commonly purchased items. And they track it over time, right? They track the cost of that basket over time. And that's what we get in the consumer price index. Now, core inflation, which we've all heard of, focuses on the underlying and persistent trends in inflation, right? And the way we do that is we exclude prices set by the government and the more volatile prices of products such as food and energy. Those are prices that are kind of affected most by seasonal factors or temporary supply shifts, right? So
consumer staples, things that people need or are going to have to consume.
Absolutely. It's in there, but we use core inflation. Policymakers look at core inflation because they're really concerned about what's persistent, right? What's not going to be transitory. We heard a lot about that transitory term, like, oh, inflation is going to be transitory. So policymakers really care about that because they want to know when and how much action to take, when to take action and how much action to take to kind of curb a sudden rise in inflation. And I couldn't finish this podcast by not addressing why it matters so much. It matters because, households' income, right? When we go to work, we get paid. And if our income does not rise as much as prices do, we're worse off, right? We can afford less goods and services, right? And our purchasing power falls. And so that's also very important, right? The fact that, and so that's why we care so much about inflation. But high inflation hurts, but it's not worse than deflation.
Let's get into deflation. So deflation, it's like you can sharpen this definition up. It's effectively when there's too many goods or services in a marketplace, right? And not enough money flowing to buy those.
Exactly. I mean, but I think it's important for people to realize that when they say to me, look, no, prices are not falling. We want prices to fall. And I say, no, be careful what you wish for. You don't want prices to fall. And here's why we don't want prices to fall. When prices fall, right, when you end up in a deflationary environment, consumers tend to delay making purchases if they can, anticipating lower prices in the future. And for an economy like that, that means less economic activity, less income generated by producers, right? So, if people are spending less, businesses generate less income. And then that also means they hire fewer people. It also means lower economic growth. But here's what's really, really crucial. Businesses tend to not cut wages, right? Like, I mean, how often have you seen your employer just decide even in a recession, employers decide, hey, we're just going to cut wages?
Literally one time in a 30 plus year work career, and it was in 2008. And then I believe it again in 2009, or maybe it was held steady. And it was the most, it was awful. It was simply awful.
And the only reason that employers began to cut wages was because unemployment soared. In other words, you have to have a mass increase in unemployment such that workers are desperate enough to accept wage declines. And so when we think about that for a second, when you hear people cheering for price declines, the right answer, the right question to ask them is, would you prefer being out of a job? The bottom line is a deflationary scenario will likely result in a mass increase in unemployment and joblessness. That is not a place we want to go to. And so, yes, high inflation hurts, but deflation is so much worse.
Thanks for making that crystal clear. For Orphe Divounguy, this has been Chris Krug. Subscribe to Everyday Economics and dozens of other quality podcasts at americastalking.com.